Welcome, everyone, to our unnamed Wednesday study session, our first one since before the high holidays. It's such a pleasure to have everyone back. So we start a little bit, as always, when we start up things, there's some technology problems. This week, we're blaming Michael Schwartz for them. And so, but it's not the Michael Schwartz here, it's a different Michael Schwartz because I know like 6. So what we're doing today is we're going to be going over this book that was suggested by Larry, Everything is Illuminated, by Jonathan Safran Foer. I hope I pronounced it right. It was a New York Times bestseller, which is pretty impressive because it's a little bit of a strange book and very Jewish in nature. So it's always interesting to see when a book that is kind of more Jewish breaks out into the wider society, which this one did. So thank you, everyone, for joining. I'm going to be leading this with Larry. Some people watched the movie. I read the book, but I didn't have a chance to see the movie. So I'm looking forward to hearing. I did read some reviews comparing the book to the movie, but I didn't see the movie. And so we're going to talk a little bit about it. And then at the end, we'll go over the schedule for the rest of the year. And we have some questions about what we're going to do for our first in-person outside event at Jeff and Flossie's house. So welcome, everybody. Larry, why don't you give us a little bit about your thoughts between the book and the movie, and we can talk and see who read the book, who watched the movie, who did both, and who didn't do either. So,
okay, there's a lot here to really unpack because the book is really quite complex. Those of you that have started to read it or have read it, it's not the typical book that goes from A to Z in chronological fashion, in time order or in series of events. It's not even typical in the fact that a book usually has some flashbacks in it, because the book is really unusual. The main plot is about this fella, Jonathan Safran Foer, who apparently gets just on the deathbed of the grandmother about a month or so before. She gives him a picture of her husband, his grandfather, who had died years ago. And it's a picture of her with a lady there. And the back of it says, "This is Jonathan with Augustine." And it's 1941, I believe, is the date on the picture. And this sets him off on a search to go to the Ukraine, which is the roots of where his father and this supposed woman Ukraine is. And I guess the grandmother says one other thing, which entices him. She says, "This is the lady that saved your grandfather rather, from the Nazis." So that sets the whole thing in motion. That's the major plot of the story. But we're taken on such a series of adventures through the book, the novel, through the movie. The movie is not totally different, but very different. What happens then in the book is we meet the 3 characters who are all named Alex, that live in the Ukraine, that have this travel agency, and they have a dog named Sammy Davis Jr. Because of course Sammy Davis Jr. is taken, so they name him Sammy Davis Jr., and he's kind of a vicious mongrel. And he, the dog, one of the youngest Alex, who was about 18 or 20 years old or so, and the grandfather, who is hard of sight, difficult sight, and he is the one that needs this dog, supposedly is a seeing eye dog. And they are the ones that are now hired to take Jonathan Safran Foer on this 3 or 4 or 5 day venture to find the town of Trachem Brod, which is in the Ukraine. If you look at the Ukraine on the map, and I had a couple of maps I intended to bring up, but it'll take too much time.
I can make you a co-host if you want to bring them up.
No, that's all right. I got to search for them and find them, but it's easier. People went back.
Come here.
You could probably see, that the Ukraine and Poland and Russia and Czechoslovakia are all very, very close together. And there are maps which show the Jewish shtetls that are in the area, with an enormous number of Jewish shtetls in that particular area. And they're looking for this one particular town or shtetl called Trachem Brod, which also had another name to it called Sofieka or something like that. And they go in search of this town. And that's really the major part of the adventure. Now, the way the book is written now is that the book is written after this adventure has taken place. So now Jonathan, you have to visualize this because it's quite complex in the book. He is back in the United States. He's back in America. And his goal now was to write a book on the history of where his grandfather came from and how the town was formed. Where he got this information, we really don't know. He picks up a few documents along the way, and he writes this book, and he sends chapters from time to time back to Alex, who was the young Alex, who was the guide. And Alex now reads these chapters and comments on them. At the same time, Alex is writing a book about how the adventure basically took place and how they were trying to find Augustine and how they were trying to find this town of Trachenbrod. So he's writing that book, and he sends chapters back to America for Jonathan to read. Okay, so we have the two of them kind of sending chapters back, and letters now take place between Alex and Jonathan, where Jonathan is receiving letters from Alex. And you could tell the style because the writer does a very interesting thing for us in the book, is that, first of all, so you have three different styles here.
Welcome, everyone, to our unnamed.
Hello.
Oh, did we lose you? Sorry. I was getting feedback from the YouTube channel, so I had to turn it off.
You have three different styles in here. You could see if he starts a chapter with that kind of a style in it, that's a chapter that is written by Alex, who is the young guide. And this is written in a very funny, broken English style. And the reader almost has to be an interpreter. But he is basically trying to tell the story of the events, how it led up to this thing, how the guides got together, how they got the job, how they met Jonathan at the railroad station, how they transported him, how they eventually went looking for the town of Trachenbrod, how they went looking for Augustine and things of that, and everything that was revealed in it. Then if you turn to another part of the book, he gives you these curvy kind of words at the beginning of the title. And when you see that, he goes back in time. And here he went back in time to, I think, 1791, or March 18, 1791. The beginning of the world often comes. And this is how the town of Trachenbrod basically started, when supposedly a man named Trachem, who is in a wagon, is racing his wagon, and he's near the river, the Broad River, and the river, the wagon is overturned, and the wagon becomes overturned. He disappears. They don't know whether or not he dies in the wagon. His body is never found. But then miraculously, something floats to the top of the wagon there, and it's a baby girl. And that baby girl, according to now Jonathan Safran Foer, in the story that he creates, is his great, 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 great grandmother in the 1790s. So that's the origin of the town of Trachem. And then every year on this anniversary, they have a celebration to basically reenact the founding of the town of Trachenbrod. Okay, so that's what the town is. The town then goes, and you could see that so every time you see these curvy kinds of things with the curvy letters, that basically is going back in time. Okay.
And it's Jonathan's.
And that's basically Jonathan's story written from the United States. The third part are letters, which are written in script. And you could see that all of the letters are dated. And these are letters that are written by Alex the guide. And they're written at different times. The first one here is 20 July 1997. And there's usually just 2 or 3 pages. And they're letters to Jonathan, and they're usually signed guilelessly Alexander, being the young guide. And in those letters, they comment on each other's writings. and they comment on the stories that each other has told and how they saw the adventure that they went on sort of differently. And, Alexander, who is the guide, says, I don't know where you got this stuff, how you made this up with some of the names that you found out and so forth. So the story then creates a journey about how the grandfather, who is the driver, who was reluctant to go on this adventure, he didn't want to go on the adventure, and he's a Ukrainian, and how the grandson, who knew very, very little about the grandfather, learns more about the journey and more about the Ukrainians than he ever knew. About anti-Semitism in the Ukraine, about how the Ukrainians hated the Jews. And the grandfather is basically silent because the grandson had always thought that the Ukrainians and the Jews were kind of friendly. And he never knew much about even the Holocaust. And there are very mysterious events which are not cleared up. It turns out they find a lady who they believe to be Augustine. She is not Augustine. In the movie, it's quite different. In the movie only takes place during the journey, and it doesn't do any of the events. It doesn't tell any of the backstory. What it does is it's a very soul-searching kind of a novel in which you learn a lot about the shtetl history, about a lot of what you might even call the mishigas of the shtetl, about the books that the shtetl keeps. The 613 types of sadness is one of the books. There are sadnesses for everything. Very much it's a book about words. And it's a book about, even in the title, about where he uses the word everything is illuminated. Illuminated can mean many, many different things. And in one of the episodes, they talk about that the Eskimos have 400 words, 400 words that mean snow. And that sometimes when you say something, a word can have so many multiple meanings, even though you only had attended one meaning to it, it could be another. You say the word, I love you. Does that word mean I love you forever? I love you because you're beautiful. I love you because of this. And he goes on and on and on. There are very funny events in the book. There are funny events because Jonathan is a vegetarian coming from the United States, and they are big sausage eaters. They can't even understand what a vegetarian is. The differences in culture are enormous in the book. There are differences between the Ukrainians in the book that they meet along the way, because some of the Ukrainians are more of the suburban, not the rural Ukrainians, who are in the countryside there, who are the laborers, who don't like the city Ukrainians, who don't like the Odessa Ukrainians. These are Ukrainians who are less educated, and they could tell by the accent. It's almost a My Fair Lady kind of thing, where you could tell by the accent that, they're a lower class, and they meet these people along the way. I don't know if I should give away the whole book, because the book is still mystifying. There are still parts to it. The major thing that you can find is that in the movie, the father, after being confronted with the town, they finally find the town of Trachtenbrod, and you can go online and you can see that there is a monument at the town of Trachtenbrod to the death of something like 1,200 of the citizens of Trachtenbrod. It turns out that Alex's grandfather had escaped prior to the Nazi invasion. It turns out that he probably was married to a woman there at the time who had died in Trachtenbrod. But he had escaped and he went to America, and that's where, prior to escaping to America, he had gone to a displaced persons camp. Apparently, they tell you in the book, where he meets his wife, and he dies very soon after coming to America. They make a point of saying that, here's a guy who had survived such an incredible life and such an incredible journey, only to have survived for a very short time. So Alex knew him for a Jonathan knew him for a very, very short time in America. But he gets this photograph, and the photograph becomes the impetus for him to try this search, for it. The real impact of the book, though, occurs when you hear the woman that they finally meet in this one house. And in the movie, it is done brilliantly because when they find the one remaining house that is near the town of Trachenbrod, it is like in a fairyland. It is surrounded by this mounds and mounds and acres of sunflowers. And they find her in this house, a very lovely, old, fragile woman. And she has a collection of everything that she had collected from the town after the massacres. And she apparently is the only surviving person from Trachenbrod. And she has photographs which she gives to Alex. And in one of the photographs in the book, there's a person that is recognized by the grandfather. The grandfather recognizes this person as Herschel. Now, there's an incident in the book, in the movie, that they're a little unclear on, but in the movie, they talk about that when the Nazis come, the Nazis get everybody to line up outside the synagogue, and then they tell everybody, they bring out the Torahs and they say, spit on it, curse the Torah, kick the Torah, and the people do that. And the Nazis then go ahead, and there's a few people that they don't, and the Nazis go ahead and they shoot those people. It turns out in the book that the supposition is that Alex's grandfather, who is not Jewish, he's the Ukrainian guide, that his friend Herschel, who was a Jewish guy, when the Nazis lined everybody up, and this is kind of unclear, but it's the supposition of Alex, the younger one in the book, that the grandfather, everybody is asked then to point out who is a Jew. The Gentiles are there and the Jews are there, and each Jew or each Gentile, the German general comes around and he says, who is a Jew? Tell me who is a Jew. If you don't tell me who is a Jew, I'm going to shoot you. And he does that for a couple of people just to set an example. And he goes from person to person, and finally everybody tells him who is a Jew. And the last one remaining is this person, Herschel, who is not a friend of anybody, and people didn't even know he was a Jew apparently, except Alex's grandfather. And Alex's grandfather reveals he is a Jew, and he says in the book that he murdered him. Well, the point of it is that in the story, in the book itself, Alex's grandfather goes, this is after the journey is complete, he kills himself. He kills himself, he can't live with this. In the movie, they have to tighten things up, and he actually kills himself and commits suicide actually during the journey himself by slitting his wrists in the bathtub. So the journey ends really with them not really finding Augustine at all. And they don't know if Augustine is really true. She probably wasn't, because it looks like the father had escaped somehow miraculously to the United States, or he had gone to to someplace in Europe to a camp or someplace. So it leaves a lot of doubts, and I think that's intentionally what the story is intended to do, whether it's stories on how the shtetl was made up, or it's stories on how history is actually written, that there are so many things that are really unknown. The ending of the movie is really beautiful. The movie has got some gorgeous music in it because it's a combination of rock and klezmer and Jewish melodies. And just for the soundtrack alone, I would recommend the movie, as well as some of the editing that takes place. And at the end, when Jonathan comes back to America at the airport in the movie, which is obviously not in the book, he sees people and he looks at their faces, and these actually are the same actors that he had seen while he was in the Ukraine. And I think what he's trying to say is the director, Liam Neeson, is trying to say here, not Liam Neeson, who was the director of this and the screenwriter. Well, anyway, he's basically trying to say we are somehow all connected genetically. That here in the United States now we're seeing in America the woman who was the waitress at the hotel that they were at, or one of the people who was in the fields that was digging for oil or whatever he was doing. So it's really a story about journeying. It's a story about self-discovery, but the real self-discovery, in my opinion, takes place not because of Jonathan's self-discovery, because he discovered very, very little, most of which he made up. It's the discovery of the Ukrainian fella who finds out about his grandfather. He finds out about Nazism and how they knew very, very little, or at least the younger generation knew very, very little about it. So with that, I'll kind of stop. I hope it's a very complicated story, but very emotional and
Great
very
synopsis. Thank you, Larry. That was really terrific. Jeff.
Larry, let me ask you a couple of questions because we did not do the book. We did only had time for the movie. But in the movie, the main question seems to be, is the grandfather a perpetrator? And I up until near the end, you get the feeling he's one of the guards and actually did the shooting. And then you see somebody climbing out of the pile of bodies, and then we assume that was the grandfather. And his burial after the suicide is a Jewish burial. They're all wearing kippahs, and they're going away from the cemetery after a Jewish burial of the grandfather. And you mentioned the grandfather was not Jewish, and he was, and see, I got a whole different, feeling from the movie.
a couple of things. I definitely don't think he was one of the guards, but he was one of the people, and they mentioned this time and time again, because the grandson says, don't think badly about it. It was a time and a place where people had to make terrible decisions at a terrible time. And I think that even though he was not a guard, he was basically had to point somebody out, and he pointed out his friend Herschel, and that's what he couldn't live with. Now,
That doesn't come across in the movie. In the movie, you have the person coming out who survives and takes off his Jewish armband and like disappears and goes back. He seems to be the grandfather.
I don't believe that was the grandfather. I don't believe
Why
that.
the Jewish burial? Why the Jewish burial?
He had a Jewish burial. At the end, when you see it at the movie, and this is not in the book, but at the end in the movie, when you see it, it's not even a burial. It's they see him at the gravesite, and you see the remains of the monument for Trachenbrod there, right?
Yes.
If you look, you see they went back to Trachenbrod. He's not at the cemetery. He's in Trachenbrod there. And there's no Jewish writing on it. He's at Trachenbrod, and the only people that are there are his son, who is also Alex, his wife, the little kid who is called Little Igor, the dog, and the bigger Alex, who is really the narrator of most of the story. And they are the one that are now at the grandfather's site, where he's buried in the town where the father came actually from the neighboring town. The grandfather actually came from the neighboring town of Kolki, Kolki. I don't know whether that's brought out in the movie as well. But yeah, the movie is different. But what the movie tries to do is to show, I think, a couple of things, in that there's a lot of guilt on the part of the people who were there. The person who climbs out, who is the only survivor of the firing squad, I believe was Jewish. He was wearing a Jewish star, and that
Right. Yes, he was Jewish in the movie.
Right, and that is neither of the grandfathers.
Oh.
Let's go to Michael and then Judy and make sure everybody has some chance.
Sure.
Yeah, Larry, thanks so much. That was just a really, really, really good summary of the book. And I looking at it, not so much from the summary, but the themes, and you alluded to this, but so much of it, there were Sophie's choices in the book. You especially the scene with the Torah and is this guy Jewish? Is that guy Jewish? Or we'll shoot your family. And I think that was that was probably the most disturbing and probably the most questioning part of the book. What choices do people make? We've talked a lot about choices in this group, and I think this was an extreme example of that. One of the things that, from a Jewish perspective, not necessarily the narrative of the book, but the town, it's a shtetl, and one tends to think of these towns as religious, and you have the esteemed rabbi. I don't remember the exact title. You have the okay rabbi, and this rabbi and that rabbi, but you. And we're with the esteemed rabbi, of course, the legacy. But the point I wanted to make is that even though it's such a Jewish theme, is is the shtetl really a religious place? Or the Jews there religious? And you kind of get the impression that they're not. Certainly in private. Publicly, are they religious? You're not even sure what they do on Shabbat. I thought that was very interesting, very different from things that I've previously read. But not that I've read that much about
Really good
life.
question. Judy, do you want to say something? And then we'll go to Larry.
I did want to, I had something I wanted to say, excuse me. But Michael, a shtetl is just a village. So it's just like any place here. So there's no reason to think it's religious. I mean, many people.
But there is. I disagree with you, Judy.
Okay. That's okay. I've been doing research on my grandparents' shtetls for years. And I know, like, my one grandfather who came from Vilna and probably went to the great synagogue there, he was a socialist and he was not much of a religious person at all. And, so, I mean, I think people are people and where they live. I mean, we're here, we belong to a synagogue. We may or may not go. We may or may not observe kashrut or Shabbat. So I would just point that out. But what I wanted to talk about was from the movie. I believe that Alex, the grandfather, was Baruch, the boy that she talked about who went to the library, couldn't read, and always held a book. And I think that he is that person, and that he is the one that lived and climbed out of the pit. And I definitely agree with Jeff that the funeral was, in the movie, definitely a Jewish funeral, and they realized then that they were Jewish. So I'm listening again to the book, and I haven't gotten to that part, but I definitely feel that the movie portrayed him. I believe he's Baruch, and that he was a Jew that gave all that up, and in many, many ways, including naming his son after himself. But anyway, that's just what I think.
It's an interesting way of looking at it. Larry, did you want to add something, or did Noel or Flossie?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention one other thing about, shtetls. Jane and I were in Warsaw, Poland, and many of the European capitals a couple of years ago. And one of the places that we did visit was one of the Jewish museums there. And the first thing you see when you walk into the Jewish museum is a map that covers the entire wall of the entry foyer, which is a monstrous entry foyer. So if you could picture a map that's maybe about 20 by 30 feet or something like that. And on that map are a series of dots, and there are thousands of dots, and every one of those dots is a shtetl. that had existed at the time. And I'm sure every one of those shtetls had individual practices and individual rabbis who taught different things and individual cultures and customs and things of that nature. I think also in the book they talk about there was a section of the shtetl that was the religious section, and there was a section that was secular section.
The slouchers.
Yeah, and that they had tried to put the synagogue on the center line
Get a little
between
closer.
the two.
That's right.
Your hand.
And it was on rollers, apparently, the synagogue, so that if the synagogue, if the congregation moved in one direction or another, they could slightly move it from one place to another. But there wasn't really very much movement. Only a small percentage, I think 25%, they said, was in the very Orthodox, and there were what they called upriders and slouchers. You know, the so-called the believers and the non-believers that were part of it. And also what's interesting is that, you know, how they made up the rules along the way. You know, the rabbi would say, well, you know, we can't do this, but we need a proclamation, you know, and they would come up with a proclamation, but we need a proclamation that says that there should be no proclamation. I mean, it goes on, and it becomes very funny. And what starts out to be a very humorous kind of a story, and even in the movie, it's a very humorous movie. It turns out to be a very dramatic and very poignant kind of a story. It's so soul searching, and it's so you know, I think pertinent to everybody in trying to find out their roots, and knowing that is basically almost impossible to really understand it. Maybe we could find a date and a place, maybe we could find a marker or a tombstone or things like that, but we have no idea of the lives that took place in these things or how those traditions got started. And I really think that to a large extent is the point of the book, as well as the other point being that the people who are there now, and we found this in Poland as well, not that we were able to speak to too many of them because very few of them spoke English, that they knew very little about even World War II. They knew very little about, except that they were invaded by the Nazis. And there was the Warsaw Ghetto, but that's in Poland, that's in Warsaw. They didn't know too much about when you go to the countryside. They knew very little about what was happening in the outskirts, you know, during World War II, except that their whole cities were decimated.
Flossie.
Two things. First of all, Larry, I would not call this movie humorous. I would call it very poignant, like you said, very self-exploratory, with some humorous asides, like when the dog came out, Sammy Davis Jr., we laughed, and you know, and
well, let me just say one thing, Flossie. What I meant to say was it starts out as a very humorous movie.
Ah,
okay.
It starts out as a very
okay.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
Because Jefferson said I wouldn't call, okay, all right. But,
maybe I didn't make that point across.
okay, all right.
Okay,
But,
correct. Okay.
Rabbi, my question is, we're talking about shtetls. What comes up to mind? It's like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Were we forced into shtetls because we couldn't live in the village with other people?
Well,
Or
and-
did
I'm
we
sorry.
want to be in with our own, and we live? Do you hear what I'm saying?
It's a mix of both, but by the 18th century is really when all the Jews were rounded and sent into this Pale settlement.
Right.
We moved there as early as, I think, the 12th, 13th century. We were invited by many countries because of our skills, but over time, things changed. I think, obviously, the Reformation was one of the major changes, but also, as time went on, again, and different groups, Protect Catherine the Great, for instance, who really was one of the chief instigators of the Pale settlement, was apparently much more liberal and did in some ways to protect the Jews. So she wasn't as hateful to them as some of the later ones. But yeah, it's a combination, but eventually a lot of them were moved in, but you also just ended up in places because Jews went to live where Jews were. And so, and they were in cities and they'd be living in the same areas, and all of a sudden it's a ghetto. So it wasn't always like we're moving you all to one place like the Nazis did. It's a lot of it was happenstance and where you end up. And but by the 18th century and 17th century, a high percentage of Jews in Europe were in ghettos and shtetls.
And what you're all saying, they all had their distinct personality.
Oh, yeah.
All right. And when you think of shtetl, I think one of the first times Isaac Bashevis Singer with Tevye, you see a shtetl.
Right.
And with the shtetl, with
Shalom Aleichem.
Shalom
Shalom
Aleichem. Okay, we'll see. And when
Close.
you go and you see the shtetl with Tevye, you see it more universal in a way in how parents are dealing with children with change and how they deal with it. Because we had foreign exchange students, remember, and we had one from Germany many years ago. And Fiddler on the Roof was so popular in Germany. And then it came out in Japan because they all saw they're dealing with children having to make issues of times changing. So it's interesting how we relate and think it's a Jewish story, but everyone doesn't always think that.
And that's probably one of the reasons it became so popular is because it is a Jewish story, but it's an immigrant story more in many respects. And so everybody can understand going back to the past. But I think it's a good question. I think the shtetl, the shtetl and Fiddle on the Roof has become the picture in our minds and probably was a pretty well done. It was definitely more religious than this one, a little bit bigger, probably more coherent, but there are different shtetls and different people viewing different things, and there's always going to be people who don't get along. But in general, one of the big differences is the rabbi of the community was also more of a legislator and more of a judicial leader as well, because the outside world usually dealt with one or two people in the shtetl for taxes, for business, for all these things. And so that gave the rabbi or whoever was the leader a lot more power beyond just the spiritual and religious. So it's important to remember the rabbi was more of what we call a rebbe. He was beyond what we call the rabbi today. Larry.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention one thing about Fiddler is that you have to also understand that the motivation for Fiddler was not so much to tell the story of the shtetl, but to tell the story of tradition. I think tradition was the most important thing that they were trying to get across, that Jewish traditions were the things that were going to survive. And I think that's what the writers, Brock and Harnack, tried to get across in Fiddler. Whereas, this one is a totally different view of what shtetls were. So I think you're seeing a point of view, as expressed by a writer. And I think you're absolutely right in saying that, it's embedded in our mind that, shtetl, the normative for shtettls is the Anatevka and the Fiddler shtetl, and it probably is not. It probably is very, very varied. There were probably shtetls that had mixed Jews and Gentiles in them, whether they were living friendly or not, I don't know, but they certainly traded with each other. But I think that Fiddler had a particular point of view, and it comes out very clear in the opening number, where they tell you everything's about tradition.
And I think we see a lot in this book that it's very poignant. Again, it is irreverently funny at times, the way he tries to describe the religious versus the non-religious, and the original origin story for that is really strange. It's a strange book because it goes back and forth so often. The English by Alex is so hilarious because it's all you assume from watching TV. And remember, this is the mid-90s, so the Ukraine has just opened up in the last couple of years. I went to Prague in the 90s, and then I went 10 years ago or 7 years ago, and they were very different cities. I mean, the difference in 20 years was night and day because they're just leaving the Soviet Union, and now they're getting open to the world. Nobody there had even met an American. Well, now, of course, Americans do travel a lot more. People are a lot more familiar with English around the world. Everybody probably has access to TV and satellite and dishes, so they are much more fluent in the world, even if you are a little bit more rural in these places. So it's very interesting to see the difference from the 90s till today. But it's an amazing book, as Larry said. some of the things I thought were really interesting were the buildup. This, once we knew that there was something the grandfather had done wrong. He was feeling guilty about something. I took it as, was he a Nazi?
Yeah.
Or was he a Jew who escaped? I didn't know what the guilt was. I saw it could have gone either way. He was a young man, so he certainly could have been somebody who helped the Nazis. And so the payoff was a little more subtle in that it was like he ended up choosing his family over his Jewish friend. And yet that makes him more powerful because the guilt is much more understandable. We can understand giving up the neighbor to save our children as opposed to him actually being a Nazi and killing people. That would have not lent us to being so looking at him so favorably, at least understanding Flossie.
Larry, what do you think the reason behind him being a collector was? And in the movie, I didn't see it, Jonathan staying in touch with Alex or looking to write a book. Do you think there was a reason in the movie they didn't have that continue?
Yeah, well, first of all, the collector part is totally in the movie. He's not a collector at all in the book. He collects.
Oh, wow.
Oh, wow.
What is it? And might as well explain that to me. What does it mean he's a collector? Who's a collector? It was not in the book at all.
Jonathan,
Jonathan is a collector, and the woman he meets.
well, explain anything he finds, he puts in a little plastic bag. And
Yes.
Oh, he did have one moment where he did that with the dirt. That was it in the book.
Yes,
throughout the movie.
and
he
the
does.
sunflower. She's a collector too.
Who is she?
The
Who's she?
the woman that he finds in the sunflower field.
Oh, the old lady. Okay, yeah. Okay.
Yes, and she's also.
Oh, she's like, yeah. That in the book, that's very much true.
And
Yeah, and it's like, it's almost though her collection in the book is almost if she's keeping stuff from the old days, and whether she was hoarding it or was keeping it as a historical, reference. That's never very clear why she kept it all those years.
That is a, I'm sorry, go on, Jane. Go on.
I was going to say that I don't remember if it was in the book or if it was in the movie, but she said, in case people come back.
correct, the movie.
It's in the book too.
Yeah, but
Well, I thought that was
those
very
people
powerful.
aren't coming back.
Yeah, I went to a
Relatives,
when I
not,
was traveling through. Oh, sorry.
it was the relatives that would come back.
Right.
Well, although this is important, there's one line that she says at one point: "Is the war over?"
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
And that was I thought that was very interesting.
Well, not only is that interesting, but also after she goes on the journey, the last thing that the woman does in the book, now this is not in the movie, is she returns and the last thing she says, I have to go back to my baby. My baby is waiting for me. Now that is really strange because here she had been away from the baby for, if there isn't even a baby, so she is delusional. I mean, there is question here about her mental, she is not totally all there, and whether or not her story is. The grandfather at one point, Alex, the grandfather, the Ukrainian, he basically at first is very belligerent toward the woman because he doesn't want to even believe what she's saying. There's one major turning point there where the father, when looking at the grandfather, Alex, who was the guide, the one who owns the dog, the Sammy Davis Jr. dog, where he is looking at one of the pictures and he says something about his parents. And Alex, the younger one, the grandson, says, this is the first time I ever remembered him mentioning his parents. And he said, did they also save somebody during the war? Because they're still caught up in the story of somebody believing, the Ukrainians believing that they saved people during the war.
Oh.
And the grandfather doesn't answer him. And the grandson now understands that maybe something is going on here, I think, for the first time, that many of the Ukrainians were as bad or worse even than the Nazis. And, you know, it's this whole 100 years almost, or 50, actually the book takes place, which is another mystery. The book takes place when the journey takes place. The only hint he gives you is it takes place 1 year after the anniversary of the constitution of the new constitution for Ukraine. And the new constitution for the Ukraine was on, I looked it up because he doesn't tell you in the book, is on June 26th, 1996. So the journey takes place in June 26, 1997. And the reason he makes a big deal of it is because the grandson doesn't want to go on this because he's got dates and it's a date for celebration. And the girls are going to be upset that he doesn't take them out on Constitution Day and things like this. But the father says, no, you got to go with the grandfather on this journey and things like that. But when do they pick Alex? When do they pick Jonathan up at the airport? July 2nd. And I'm thinking, wait a minute now, the author who was so researched in this must have known that Constitution Day was June 26th. Why would he not have, still have allowed Alex on June 22nd, on June 2nd, July 2nd, if he had to pick him up? There's still a 2 or 3 day lap, which to me also shows something about the unreliability of any kind of a reporting. I'm not saying false lies or, false reporting, but just the infallibility of our memories of even under the most accurate circumstances of documents that we really truly know. And it just kind of puzzled me, even though it's pretty close, the dates, the June 26th and the date that they pick him up, because he gives you no other clue. He makes you really search for that date if you really want to find it, that the Constitution date is June 26th, but the date they pick him up is actually July 2nd. The times just don't kind of match up. And it's just a little bit more of a puzzlement for me.
Flossie.
Larry, did you or the rabbi do any research into the author? I'm just curious who the author was and why he did this book.
I didn't, except for some of the acknowledgments that are in the introduction to the book, where he basically, I'm trying to think of who he dedicates the book for my family. I don't know whether or not it was on a real journey that he had ever taken, or what actually caused him to write the book at that particular time. I haven't even looked to see if he's written, I'm sure he's written a second novel. If you do have a copy of the paperback has on it, he was 24 years old, first novel.
24 only, wow.
First novel for a person to write, and some of the sex scenes that he writes here, and he writes about scenes.
There's a lot of that. That was not my favorite. But unlike Larry, I was really prepared. So let me just tell you what I memorized about him. He was born in Washington, D.C. as the son of Albert Foyer, a lawyer, president of the American Antitrust Institute, and Esther Saffron Foyer, child of Holocaust survivors born in Poland, who's now a senior advisor at the 6th and I Historic Synagogue. He's the middle son of a Jewish family. His older brother is the former editor of the New. So I did a lot of research, as you can tell, into this, or I just put on Wikipedia just now. So.
Has he written a second book, Rabbi?
Yeah, he wrote one other famous one that I've heard of. It was called Everything Loud. What's it called? Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close. That was a very prominent one about 9/11. And I think they made that one into a movie. So that was like his second big hit. But it's an incredible, Noel.
Yeah, before we come to the end of the class, I want to just mention a book, not for this group, but I Zoomed a Jewish book review site. And this is the true story, Becoming Eve, my journey from ultra-Orthodox rabbi to transgender woman. And it's a true story. I'm not recommending it for here, but somebody that's just interested in Jewish history, it's fascinating. It's just so fascinating. So if somebody wants to just read it,
And what
I
we are
just
going
wanted to mention.
what we are doing is we're going to, we're doing we'll give one more thing and then we'll conclude with some updates on what's coming up. So first of all, thank you, Larry, for that. Oh, sorry, Jane, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I do. I have one question, and I didn't quite understand why Alex, the tour guide, died. I don't understand that.
In the movie?
No,
Oh, you
in the-
mean
In
the
book.
driver.
No,
no,
the young boy, the
The
young,
young one, he dies he didn't die in the book.
he
yes,
does,
he
yeah.
died in the book.
Which
Yeah.
one are you talking about?
Movie.
Everything is
no.
illuminated.
In the book, in the last letter that he writes to
Oh,
Jonathan,
yes, he says, if you're reading this, I'm dead.
reading this
Yes.
letter, this means
Yes.
that I've already passed away.
Yeah, but I thought that was the grandfather who said it, and then the grandson translated it.
No, I don't think so, Rabbi.
No, I don't think
And
so.
that's the only letter that he signs differently. He signs it "Love Alex," or he doesn't sign it
Not
"Guile."
at all.
He basically, well, the one that he says grandfather died 4 days ago. That's the one that is January
Right.
1998. And then the last letter that he writes, he says that he talks about, let me see.
I thought this was a letter from the grandfather to Jonathan after he killed himself, and he translated it.
22 January 1998. If you're reading this, it is because Sasha, which is his father now, found it and translated it for you. It means that I am dead.
Oh, so Sasha, the father, translated it.
Right, and that Sasha is alive.
Yeah.
So the interpretation there is that Alex is dead. And
At least that's what I thought.
right, Jane and I discussed this already, and I think that is kind of a puzzlement why Alex, the younger Alex now, the grandson Alex, took his life. The guide.
Right. I have to reread it because I read it a couple times because it says, well, we can talk about that later. And we got to finish up. But yeah, we'll look at that and discuss it because I did not, if it was him, it was out of blue because it came out of nowhere that he killed himself without any posse.
No, I just want to say, it's so interesting, us all sitting and discussing, because we saw the movie and so much you all were talking about, we weren't exposed to because we didn't read the book. And
Right.
if anyone read the book, they don't know things we saw
Yeah.
in the movie that, The other question I have to ask Larry, a very quick one. What did you think of the casting of the movie, Larry? Did you like who played the characters?
Absolutely sensational. I thought that they were dead on. I thought the characters were brilliant. Every one of them, I thought.
Dead
was-
on, watch that.
cast perfectly. And I thought the narration, the movie, as I said before, is worth seeing because of the transition that takes place from what you think is, wow, I'm going to sit here and be funny like Borat, and all of a sudden it becomes this very serious movie. But it doesn't come serious as enough as in the book. The book, the hairs actually rise on the back of your head when you read those Nazi scenes of the killing, and they don't come across as strongly in the book. The book, it occurs way too incidentally, I thought, in there. The book, obviously, the movie actually has to be very, very short, has to shorten and quicken things up. But brilliant, and the music is just magnificent. The way, the editing, the movie, the cinematography is just magnificent.
But the best is if you can get the audio book, because the audio book is terrific.
Right.
Here, it's in an audio book.
If you can get the Hoopla link and you hear the book read, we read it, I read it, I heard the audio link, and we saw the movie, and
You're dedicated, Larry. Nice job. It's impressive.
you get so involved in the character, and when you want to hear it in the hands of an experienced actor, it is absolutely brilliant what an actor can do.
But it's not that, it brings it all together. And because when I read the book, I was so confused. I said, oh, forget it. This is like Mishkas.
It takes a while to get used to it as you're reading.
It's dedication. It's a puzzle.
Larry, the book's title is Everything is Illuminated, but if you read online, people's interpretation of why the grandfather kills himself, it's all over the wall. So I mean, it's from high to low in different opinions. One says he's an anti-Semitic Jew who can't live with this. Another one says he has no guilt, but his life is complete. What I'm saying is it's all around the clock. And so if everything is illuminated, it doesn't seem to be clear to everybody.
Everything has a double entendre in the
everything.
entendre. There's in the book, there's the use of the word change, which has a double entendre. Change meaning my clothes got dirty and I wanted to change them, but yeah, she gets a note from the gypsy girl, which is not in the movie, and the note, which he never reads, actually says change on it. And there's so many of these kind of words that have double meanings.
I also liked the collector, as you call her, the woman. I went to Morocco, as I said, and I went to one of the places outside of, I think, Fez, and they have the cemetery there, but they also have a building which carries all of the memories of the entire village that was there before they disappeared. It's just rooms and rooms of stuff. This whole giant room is all about the classroom where all the kids studied. This one's all, and it's almost a museum, except for just things thrown in there. And you think that shtetl is gone completely. There is nothing left, but the memories are in this room with this lady, but she's not passing them on to anybody. So when she dies, that stuff's going to be gone. So the idea that these shtetls, some of which were there very long, some not so long, completely disappear without any records. And we still have very little from the shtetl times compared to how many there were in terms of records. So it's a shame that, I was hoping that somebody would go in the book and save this woman's, life as she's had all of these things. But I'm going to conclude with one piece that I thought was, and I was reading one of my favorite passages, which I was reading some of the reviews that have the same thing. Jews have 6 senses: touch, taste, sight, smell, hearing, and memory. While Gentiles experience and process the world through the traditional senses and see memory only as a second order means of interpreting events, for Jews, memory is no less primary than a prick of a pin or its silver glimmer or the taste of the blood it pulls from the finger. The Jew is pricked by a pin and remembers other pins. It is only by tracing the pinprick back to other pinpricks, when his mother tried to fix his sleeve while his arm was still in it, when his grandfather's fingers fell from stroking his great-grandfather's damp forehead, when Abraham tested the knife point to be sure Isaac would feel no pain, that the Jew is able to know why it hurts. When a Jew encounters a pin, he asks, what does it remember like? And this is a lot about memory and about the passing on and the continuation and the ancestral nations, and how memory is more than just records stored in a room. It's what we pass on to the next generations. And this is a little bit about how memory is lost when you don't pass it down, especially after such a traumatic experience.
Very dramatic, very good.
That a lot of that generation did not feel comfortable passing it on for understandable reasons. And so, very interesting book. So Flossie, we're now going to just take a moment to go over the schedule, because we're going to start our monthly in-person event in 2 weeks. So next week, we're going to go online. We're going to do one of the philosophers from the Many Faces of God. Then we're going to go to Jeff and Flossie's home and do the Dead Sea Scrolls. So Jeff and Flossie, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, we're trying to get opinions from people, whether they want it strictly outside in our yard or they want to come inside. Also, I discussed with several friends earlier this morning to serve as far as just fruit, that it's not coming in. Some people don't feel as comfortable coming in and eating. So with the group that's here now, except our Texas Energy bunny here, will you be attending, coming to our yard? Do you feel more comfortable outside? Judy, Michael? Are you planning on?
I would
coming?
come if it's outside, but I would not eat anything, so.
All right, okay. Michael, will you come outside? We can't hear you.
Now you can hear me. I would prefer outside, for sure.
So Rabbi and I talk. So Rabbi, when it's sent out to the rest of the group, tell them it'll be outside. And as far as serving, Judy said she won't eat. We'll probably just put out fruit or something with toothpicks, easy
Oh,
enough.
perfect. Yeah, that's a great idea with the toothpicks.
Yeah.
Rabbi, okay, so not knowing what the weather will be in 2 weeks,
That's true.
what do we do if it rains?
If it rains, I think we just go to virtual. Just make it easy for everybody. We
Right.
can't, just having an alternative sites, and you have to have a really pretty large room for everybody to feel comfortable. We'd have to go to rent one of the places you have in the Blessed.
Yeah, okay. So I think what we need to do is the day before, based on the forecast, decide if it's a go or a no-go.
Good idea. And it's going to be virtual no matter what. So I'm either going to be virtually streaming it from outside. Do you guys have Wi-Fi? If you don't, I can use.
I have Wi-Fi. I'll
If
have
it doesn't
to
reach
test
outside, I'll use my phone.
Yeah, I'll have to test if it works from near the lake location here.
I can use my hotspot if needed.
Yeah,
But so it's going to be virtual no matter what. That's important for people who just want to do that.
Rabbi, to ask my neighbors here from Sun City, if we want to use the pavilion, do we have to pay to use it? Does anyone know?
Yes,
Yes.
How much does it cost?
Won't do
it's
that.
$200 if you're not a club, registered club here. Mhm.
yeah,
And
it's too big. It's too big anyway for,
Well, maybe in the future, it'll be a big. How much does it cost to rent if you are a club member?
Well, if you're a registered club, it's free because you can use it, right, Michael? But you also have.
Well, that's not exactly true. I
Okay,
mean,
you have to use one of your meeting
I
days.
don't remember exactly how much it was. I think it's about $80, and
Well, it might be worth a try to try it one of these
the thing
days.
that you can do is if it's not being used and you go in there, no one's going to stop you. I don't.
Yeah, but you won't have a
believe.
microphone or speaker.
Yeah, but you won't have that. I mean, the microphone
do that
and
addition.
speakers are extra.
Yeah.
The
Well,
sound system
let's
is
have it that it'll be at
it's
our
$10 for one mic.
It
We
will be
can
in
down the
our
way.
yard unless the weather is bad. And one other thing to say, we are a core group here. There are so many that were part of us that are not tuning in now. I think if each of us took a name and just called someone and said, we've missed seeing you, we're meeting in Floss and Jeff's yard in 2 weeks, hope you can make it.
And I talked to a lot of people about that, and most people said they just want to do it. They liked once a month. So if they can come to the once a month in person thing, I think we'll get a nice group too. Noah.
right,
But it's
okay.
just letting them know.
Yes, being in Texas, how do I?
It's going to be the exact same. It's going to be the same thing for you, Noel. It'll be the exact same thing. I'm just going to take my computer to their house.
Okay.
So it'll be a different viewpoint because you'll see all of us, but I'll be close so you can hear as much as possible.
I have to get in Jeff and Flossie's yard and see what's growing there.
Larry,
Rabbi, can I ask one question about when we meet again next week? Is it next week or in 2 weeks we're going to
we're
meet?
meeting every week, but next week, 2 weeks is at Jeff and Flossie's, but we're meeting every week still if people want to. And we're doing, next week, we're studying, we're going to go through again the many faces of God a little bit at a time. So next week is October 13th. And I haven't picked out, I probably should pick out the one we're going to do.
That's what I was going to suggest is, could we do Harold Kushner? We have not
Harold
done.
Kushner is perfect because he was later in there and we hadn't done him. So we're going to do Harold Kushner next week. Is he in this one? No, he's in the other one. Is he?
No,
He's in the other book.
no, I thought he was in the Many Faces of God.
Oh, you're right. He is. You're right. So Harold Kushner it is. My bad. So it is on chapter 12, Harold Kushner.
You could pick another one to just give us your
I
thoughts.
think that's the best one because he's probably the most well-known.
Yep.
And I'm just writing this down on the thing so I don't forget. Perfect, great idea. And of course,
I'll mention that Harold Kushner's parents came from a shtetl, which is a big one called Suwalki,
oh, really?
and they're buried in the Suwalki Landsman Society with my grandparents, which is very close to where the Rebbe Schneerson is. So yeah, when you go there, there's like a ton of people. But yeah, Harold and his brother.
I think he's still living.
Oh yeah, and he and his brother are both rabbis, and their father Julius was a Jewish educator. And I can tell you a lot about their family.
And it's very similar. I'm sorry, Joe, go ahead.
No.
I was just saying, it's very similar that like this book broke out, so did his book in the 70s, was one of the early Jewish books that broke out beyond the Jewish world.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
I have actually a video of him giving the talk about his book, when bad things happen to good people, which I could show one time. It's 1 hour. I think I'm not sure if I only have it on VHS, but I may have been able to transcribe it, which is interesting to hear because, you can hear his, it's very interesting to hear him talk about why he chose that particular topic.
Yeah, that was one of the, I imagine one of the most difficult things for him was to write about that. But it's always a pleasure. Larry, that was a really terrific introductory synopsis. I think it's a very difficult book to read because it goes back and forth. Flossie?
I'm surprised, Larry, having the clout he has, that he didn't have the author with us.
Yeah, I think the word is disappointed.
Disappointing, Larry.
Yeah. But yeah, I think
I don't want to answer.
Who is the author of the book? Because at the end of the movie, if you remember, you see a transcript being sent in the mail from Alex to Jonathan, and the author of the book is Alex.
Oh, well, you could have had either. It was your choice.
Yeah. And of course, Jonathan is the author of everything.
Well, I'm just wondering if he really is now, and if he did he split the money with Alex?
Yeah. So really, like I think somebody said, the word illumination is really almost a play on words. It's a joke. Things are very difficult to illuminate.
Right.
Well, and the next book we are, to let people know, we decided to do once a month to do the book review. On the next one, November 3rd, is going to be The Weight of Ink. I forgot who. So if anybody has books to promote, just let us know. But that's the one that was decided. I forgot who that's by. I have not read it. I'm going to have to read it.
Rabbi,
You guys are forcing me to read. Stop it.
What did you say the one?
Weight of Ink was by Rachel Kaddish.
Okay, The Weight.
The Weight of Ink.
Yeah, that was recommended by somebody. I don't remember. That's what we chose. And that'll be for November 3rd. I don't know if there's a movie about that. Maybe we should only choose books that have movies.
And we get Larry
We
joining.
can do one that did both. We'll do Lord of the Rings or The Wizard of Oz. I've done the movies and the books.
Are there any Star Trek books, or are they only movies?
A lot of Star Trek books. My wife reads a lot of them.
Well,
How do you tie Jews into Star Trek?
Oh, that is the easiest thing ever. Star Trek is basically Jewish incarnate.
oh, yes,
Yes.
yes.
It's all about.
By the way,
I believe Chapter's going into space.
He is a nice Jewish boy is going to space.
Yeah.
and everything is illuminated, of course. The movie was Bodar from Lord of the Rings.
It's Elijah Wood.
Yeah.
Elijah Wood.
Yeah, Elijah Wood.
Yeah. I knew that, but I'm going to have to see the movie now. My wife has seen the movie. She really liked it, but I thought I just wanted to do the book first. Well, thank you
Yeah.
guys. It was such a pleasure studying with you as
Thank you
always.
very much.
Great to
Thank
see
you,
you.
Larry. That was great.
And just to let you guys also know, in case you're wondering, Friday night services once a month. The second Friday of the month is going to be virtual. If anybody wants to participate or in the service, just let me know. All right. Stay safe, everyone. Live long and prosper.
Yeah.
Oh, wow, look at
Yeah,
that.
live long and prosper.